Give me your thoughts on the coronavirus right now, Doctor, and where do you think we stand with this very bizarre disease?
Well, I think the first thing, is the opportunity for people to not get caught into this fear-mongering and to really step back and get educated a bit, and I hope to do that to help people. And that begins with understanding the immune system. The problem is biologists, by and large, do not study systems. They study parts of the complex pathways in the immune process, but they don't understand the entire system. Unfortunately, the medical school education also makes ignorant most MDs about how the immune system works. So the first question is, the first observation is that it's not the virus. This is going to sound, going counter to what's been put out there. It's not the virus that harms or kills us. Okay, and if you ask the typical medical school student or the MD, what's going on here, they'll typically, they themselves have been taught, or they think that the virus is some, type of monster that's going and eating your tissues, and that the vaccine comes in and blocks that. But that's far from what's really going on. The reality, it's a weakened and dysfunctional immune system that overreacts.
In the individual, right?
In a particular individual, right? Based on their particular genetics, epigenetics, and what's called stress inoculation. Everyone is different. That's one of the things that emerged when the Genome Project ended in 2003, that it turns out that we only have about 20,000 genes, the same number of genes as a worm. When we went into the Genome Project in 1993, the thought was we knew a worm had 20,000 genes. We thought we would have 1 million genes. We have about the same number of genes. So what emerged out of the Genome Project, it's epigenetics, which means the things that surround us, what we eat, the things that we put in us, these can turn on and turn off genes. And that, as you said, varies by the individual. So the other thing that emerged from the Genome Project when it ended was one size does not fit all, and medicine realized it needed to move to a personalized medicine, which meant the right medicine for the right person at the right time. Coincidentally, or incidentally, that's how traditional systems of medicine are. I grew up in a small village in India when I was a kid, and my grandmother practiced traditional systems of medicine. Even though two people had the same problem, it didn't mean they actually got the same medicines. So what we have is, when the immune system, again, varies by person to person, that when a virus comes in, you have about 380 trillion viruses in you right now.
Jeez.
We have about 6 trillion cells.
All trying to take over our bodies, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And we emerged out of that, right? So our body has, otherwise we wouldn't exist. The immune system is the operating system of the body, and it has emerged out of that. We've, it's 7.2 billion of us, right? So it's not like we're some weak species. We've emerged from that. We know how to fight viruses. Every microsecond your body is detecting pathogens. It turns on various subsystems to modulate that and take care of it, right? So that's a normal mode. If you look at, for example, Italy, the median age of people who died was in their 80s, right?
Right.
It's the underlying and immunocompromised. This aspect is not even highlighted in the press. The people who are dying, the 98% are the people who are immunocompromised with underlying conditions, or they're elderly. And why is that? Well, once you understand the immune system, it's easy to explain this, because as you age, your thyroid function, for example, gets depleted. As you age, you have less hydrochloric acid. And as thyroid level goes down, your body's not able to convert carotenoids, which is from foods even if you're eating properly, into vitamin A. Vitamin A literally, and again, unfortunately, the big pharma medical school education doesn't teach most MDs this. If you ask an MD, how does vitamin A work, they can't really explain it to you.
No, they don't know.
Vitamin A creates cytokeratins, which literally build shielding around your cells. So that's one important function. The other piece of this is that vitamin D is extremely important. when you get proper UVB, radiation, your body takes that and it makes vitamin D. Well, that vitamin D is then converted to a very, very important chemical called cathelicidins. And these cathelicidins are like bullets that literally are fired and disrupt the membrane of bacteria and viruses, etc. So vitamin D is literally an antibacterial.
Well, funny you say that, too, because a couple weeks ago, the former head of the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, said that vitamin D is essential to try to battle this coronavirus.
Yeah, when did he say that? A couple of days ago?
About a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, so he probably started saying that after I sent a letter to the president saying that we should really be triaging the people that we have. We don't need to shut down the entire country. We do need to take care of the people, let's say we're diagnosed with it. We should take care of the people who are immunocompromised and the critical people. These are three different high-risk groups, but the majority of us, we should support ourselves with proper vitamin D, supplementation, vitamin A and vitamin C supplementation, get back to work. We need to balance immune health with economic health. So what's happened is, instead of doing that, instead of understanding that the immune system is the strength of the immune system is directly a function of its ability to be resilient.
Doctor, we're going to take a break in a second, but I got to ask you this. Do you really believe that one person in Wuhan who apparently got this at a wet market of diseased animals has caused all this across the planet? One person?
No, that doesn't seem to make sense. In fact, they haven't even been able to find patient zero, as I understand.
Right. Exactly. There's something else going on here. The fact that they had a viral lab in Wuhan, somebody's been playing around with something.
Well, also in Wuhan, there were massive protests taking place against the Chinese government 6 months before. And we should talk about that, too.
Yeah, let's talk about that when we come back. And I suspect that this virus has probably been in the system much longer than we think. It's got similarities to the seasonal flu. For all we know, people who thought they had the flu had the coronavirus months and months ago. So we're going to come back in a moment with Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai and talk more about this. Next hour, we'll open up the phone lines and we'll take your calls. Very serious subject, but he's somebody who's been at it, and I really respect his views.
The Free Coast Zone email.
And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you, along with Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai, as we are talking about the coronavirus. Dr. Shiva's website, by the way, is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. When he was 14, he created email. We'll talk about that a little bit later on tonight. But right now, the information he's given us about the coronavirus is, I just think, very critical to us. So what about this possible theory, Doctor, that there's an uprising in Wuhan? The Chinese government wants to quell it, wants to punish those people. They've got a lab there that's been working on biological warfare. All of a sudden they decide, well, we're going to stop this. We're going to dump this stuff here and see how many people either die or get sick, and then this disruption will quell. It'll go away. What do you think of that possibility? Doctor, are you there? No, he is not there, so we'll have to call him back. Doggone. If not, we'll do open lines for the remaining hour and a half. Well, we'll get him back, and we'll pick him back up again and see where he is right there. But that is an intriguing part of this entire situation, that something weird is going. They cannot find, as he mentioned earlier, they can't find patient zero. Patient zero means the very first person who came down with this virus in Wuhan, China, and then it spread all over the planet quickly, too. And I find that, and he finds that hard to believe. It's just, it's bizarre that so many people across this planet already would come down with this. And it's just, it doesn't make any sense at all. So, Tom, do we have him yet? Hello, Doctor, you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, we lost you there for a while. Did you hear my question, or were you gone?
Yeah, please repeat. I didn't get it.
Okay. My thoughts are, so you've got this uprising in Wuhan. The people are upset with the Chinese government. So the Chinese government decides, we got to stop this. We have to quell this. We've got a lab here that plays around with biologicals. Let's dump this virus on these people and shut this disturbance down. And of course, it got out of control. What do you think of that?
Well, I've shared this. When you look at in China itself, if you just go back 6 months, what was going on? You had Hong Kong protests, right? We forgot completely about them now. And that was headline news.
Exactly.
The people in China, just as much as other people, also want clean air, clean water, and clean food for their children. The Chinese government has had a major problem with pollution. Remember, the Paris Accords allowed China to pollute another 11 billion metric tons of carbon. It wasn't something that was frankly good for the environment. That was all propaganda. But the Paris Accords incentivized China to pollute until 2030. So China's had a major garbage problem, and anyone can look this up. And the only way for them to handle that garbage problem has been to burn it. So in cities throughout China, for the last 10 years, they've been burning their garbage, building these large incinerators. And even though it's dangerous and deadly to protest in China, there have been massive anti-pollution protests. In fact, in Wuhan, in the Hubei province, which is Wuhan's a city, there was nearly 10,000 people protesting on the streets and growing. This was around June. And suddenly these protests disappeared because the Chinese government decides to back off because they were growing and growing and growing, right? This is in Wuhan itself. So you have that, and let's not forget, if you look at it globally, you have protests in Venezuela. Remember, we had massive protests we used to see on TV in France.
That's right.
For that, South Africa, all of these things were going on. There was massive dissent. And then you had two populist leaders who'd come out. One was in India, Modi, major election. He beat out a dynasty, and Donald Trump. So you have all of these major anti-establishment events taking place in the world. And for the global elites, in my opinion, this was not a good thing for them. And in 2008 and 9, you had Obama save the big banks by implementing quantitative easing, which essentially kicked the problem down the road. See, all these phenomena were taking place, right before our very eyes. And then boom, we have this virus. And by the way, let's not forget, there was a growing anti-vaccine movement in this country.
For sure, absolutely.
And a growing movement for health and well-being, et cetera. So all these, in many ways, were a trigger point that one could argue could have been very valuable for those people who didn't like dissension that was starting to grow, who wanted to potentially crash an economy to affect a sitting president like Donald Trump, because they could not get him on impeachment, they could not get him on Russian collusion. And what a wonderful opportunity to crash the economy, which was one of his highlights, right, throughout his...
Oh, yeah, that was his big platform, that things were great.
Right. So that's why I did that tweet several weeks ago, which sort of went viral, talking about, as an MIT PhD in biological engineering who studies the immune system, the fear-mongering of this, in my opinion, had multiple motives, right? You crash the economy, you put down dissent, and you tee it up for medical mandates. Right? So that's what this is all about, in my opinion, because if you look at the Chinese elite, the Chinese Communist Party, and you look at their interests along with the World Health Organization, or something like the Gates Foundation, the Clinton Global Initiative, the Zuckerberg-Chan Foundation, these people have a very similar interest, and it's the same with Fauci. Fauci has built his entire career over the last 40 years promoting a very, very unfortunate mistruth, that's to be kind, that how viruses operate, and for example, HIV causes AIDS. When that's proven, there's no proof for that. HIV, Africans, I think 60-70% of Zambians have the virus, and they're not dead. And so this is not his first rodeo. His friend Robert Gallo was brought up on scientific misconduct charges. Fauci stepped in to get him off of that, and Fauci became put himself as a front man, and he's built his entire career on this very erroneous view of science, of the immune system. In my opinion, it's a complete fake science that he's promoted, fear-mongering. And that's what we have here today. So what you have is, you have a virus that comes maybe out of China, let's assume it does, or somewhere else that was brought into China. I mean, there's many, many possibilities here, but we do know we haven't found patient zero. In fact, of the first 41 patients that they found, 13 of them didn't even interact with those people.
Well, and I had a story tonight, Doctor, that one of the female doctors in China who discovered this coronavirus is missing. They can't find her.
Yeah, look, China does not treat its people well. Over 200 million cameras are put out throughout China, which can read people's lips. It's essentially a police state, and it's essentially, abuses its own people. Their whole cities, which are cancer cities, but the people in China have also wanted their own freedom. The Chinese Communist Party is essentially a small set of elites. Imagine the entire U.S. government merging with the top Fortune 1000 companies. It's really crony state capitalism. That's what China has. And the events that when you connect the dots and you look at it, all these movements, dissension movements, just literally disappeared after this, right?
No, they sure did. And I got to tell you, when they do come out with a vaccine, a lot of people who have been opposed to vaccines are going to be begging for the shot.
Well, here's the interesting thing, right? Not only that phenomenon, a year from now, what happens? And, let's look at September coming out, flu season starts coming out.
That's right.
You could easily see a mandate saying, hey, you can't go to the gym. Where's your vaccine card? You can't get your driver's license. Where's your vaccine card?
Geez.
You can't get on the subway. So what you will see is this is a wonderful opportunity to essentially force vaccines with potentially the power of the state. Denmark has just, I think, 2 Thursdays ago, imposed a law that the Danish government has the right to will have the right to come into your home and force treat you, e.g., means vaccinate you.
Jeez, this is a nightmare.
Yeah. So you could see that occurring also here in the United States, and so I think we're at a very interesting inflection point of really about freedom being subverted in the interest of big pharma, has monetary interest in this. And why is that? The reason is that pharmaceutical companies are in a dead-end business. The pharmaceutical drugs, which means synthetic compounds, that's what a pharmaceutical drug is, they're miserably failing. Year over year, pharma companies are investing in R&D, 30% year-over-year investments, and the FDA, even the FDA, is allowing less and less new drugs because of the toxicity. And so what you have is, it takes $5 billion for a pharmaceutical company to create a single drug. That drug could easily be taken off the market because of because of side effects, and they are liable. And it takes a huge, long regulatory process to get a drug through the system. Now consider a different alternative that Big Pharma has, which is vaccine. And what's different? Well, low liability, no risk for them. And why is that? When in 1962, the National Vaccine Act was put into place by John Kennedy, at a time when they had a very, very minimalistic understanding of the immune system. And the notion was vaccines were the cure-all. Well, by 1986, people are filing lawsuits left and right against vaccine manufacturers. In fact, I think there's about 1,000 lawsuits at that point, and I think 5 to 10 lawsuits a day. So what ended up happening was, in order to rescue the vaccine manufacturers, Ted Kennedy, another Kennedy, along with Orrin Hatch and Waxman, creates the National Vaccine Injury Program. What did that do? what it did was it created a vaccine court. So think about this. We're supposed to have, according to the Constitution, 3 branches of government, right?
That's right.
The executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Well, they literally ripped a portion of the judicial department, element out, and they shoved it under Health and Human Services. They created what's called the vaccine courts. And the vaccine courts are where parents were forced to go to adjudicate themselves, and that had a limit of $250,000 per child if a child was died from vaccines. So the whole thing became a racket because you could not sue the pharmaceutical company. You had to sue in vaccine courts, and you and I paid for that.
Exactly.
So
and
totally
you brought up something I didn't think about, which is very scary, and that is mandatory vaccines. It didn't even dawn on me
that's
that
what this is going on. I mean,
yeah.
I was at one of in January 13th, literally when the coronavirus is just about to start. We're starting to hear news. Is when we won a major victory through protests that I led in New Jersey. To basically, they weren't able to get their vaccination bill through. So I find it very, very coincidental. Literally right after that, coronavirus is everywhere on the news. And it's really important to understand that prior to that victory, many of these movements, as you know, also have controlled opposition. A guy like Bobby Kennedy, who's been involved in this movement for 17 years, claiming he's against vaccines or, putting himself in that role, had endorsed Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is totally pro-vaccine. And their entire model was begged to legislators. We know all these legislators are corrupt. When I got involved, I said, look, the whole issue here is there's no vaccine risk assessment. I called the first international conference on vaccine risk assessment in Cambridge. And I said, look, people need to take to the streets. You need to build a broad movement, and then maybe the politicians will listen. But you don't have any firepower until you build a movement, and that's what the people in New Jersey did. They listened to my advice, and that's why we won. So these movements have been growing, and for the vaccine manufacturers and big pharma, they're frankly dead without vaccines. They're not going to make any money. They can't survive.
No, you're right about that.
Yeah, so you have the vaccine. Remember, the history of big pharma, if people really study them, was always using the most fear-mongering and ignorance marketing campaigns. That's what they're based on. Always fear-mongering and the most amazing PR and marketing campaigns. Well, if you now take that on a global scale, in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals 3, SDG 3, was put forward by the WHO and the WHO. And you know what's fascinating? Those Sustainable Development Goals present this marketing model. We're going to have utopia. Utopia is no income inequality, all sexuality, transgender rights, and, no more CO2 or, carbon-free when CO2 is not a pollutant. You read it, it's quite extraordinary. 17 points of this, utopia. What's even more interesting, in another document called the IA 2030 Immunization Act, it basically says that we are going to achieve utopia, listen to this, by immunizing everyone.
Oh, my God. That's dangerous.
No one will be left behind.
Doctor, stay with us. We're at the top of the hour. We're going to come back and talk more with you about this. I want to get your impressions on the so-called flatten the curve, that approach to basically incubate everybody. Was that the smart thing to do? The country is hurting right now. People are out of work. And then we'll take phone calls next hour with you right here on Coast to Coast AM. Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai with us. We will be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you. Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai with us. Shiva, for the last several weeks, this country has been on lockdown where people have been told to stay home. Businesses have shut down. Restaurants have been closed. It's been really a disaster for a lot of people who are healthy enough to work. But the numbers continue to go up with this coronavirus. It doesn't seem like the flattening of the curve is working. What's your take on all that?
Well, I think one of the important things to understand is that the WHO, this is something very interesting I recently learned from people who work in large hospitals with these hospital administrators. The WHO came up with, I believe, 2 codes. People should understand that the WHO, when you go to a doctor's office and the doctor diagnoses you, the diagnosis has codes which get punched into a computer, and typically those codes go into a computer system, which is created by different information technology companies. The information technology companies, what I just found out recently, have to pay to license the codes from the WHO. Quite interesting. It's a money-making venture for the WHO. So
Sure is.
WHO came up with 2 diagnosis codes, out of the international codes for COVID. One is if you have been proven to have COVID with the test. The second code is a much more nebulous one. It's sort of like very squishy. Well, I think this guy has COVID. It sort of smells like he has it, or, it smells like a duck, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
It's not definitive. Those 2 codes are what are used to diagnose someone or to put into the diagnosis codes. The AMA in the United States owns what are called what procedure you run, right? In order to, so if you do intubate someone, right? That's a different code, all right? So what's fascinating is in Italy, the news goes that, first of all, by the way, 38% of the people in Italy are over the age of 65. So when people come, and by the way, the other thing, if you talk to any Italian, they'll tell you never want to get stuck in an Italian hospital, okay? They're quite horrible.
Right.
Right. And so think about this. 38% of the people are over 65. And by the way, the median age of people who are dying was 80. These are just facts. Anyone can go look them up. And as when someone was coming into the hospitals to get their code, they were mixing both codes, okay? Well, some guy's 65, 68, 70 years old, and they're breathing heavily. Oh, COVID, okay?
Bingo.
So
Yeah.
the books are definitely being cooked in Italy because of this coding scheme and this nebulous second code. In the United States, the CDC sent letters out to all the hospital administrators basically telling them that, essentially incentivizing them to code things as COVID. So, for example, when someone dies, it takes around 14 days in some cases to get the test. You know what they do? They don't know what they had. They're putting it as COVID because they ordered the test. So one of the things we need to understand is that the books are being cooked because it benefits someone to promote the fear-mongering. It comes back to just follow the money. Follow the money, and what is the goal here? It seems to me like the goal here is really a big test of centralized government. How much can the state have power over your lives? That's what this is really about. How much can they tell us to stay in our homes? How much can they basically apply a one-size-fits-all model?
And they're getting away with it, right? At this point, they're getting away with it.
They're getting away with it because health policy is leading economic policy by Emperor Fauci. And, I've been saying this, and apparently I just heard today that he's having to get security or something. And I don't know if that's because of, the fact that and it's quite interesting because here's a guy who's connected deeply with pharma. And if anyone needs security, it's probably people like me who are exposing pharma. I think President Trump said that, he's fine, nothing's going to happen to him. But it's very interesting how a guy like Fauci starts victimizing himself as though he's, under any threat, when the reality is that in the United States right now, the number one cause of death is heart disease.
Then cancer.
Number 2 is cancer. The number 3 is medical errors, around 440,000 people. Number 4 is prescription drug deaths. People actually taking prescription drugs, about 200,000. So if you add 3 and 4 medical errors and prescription drug deaths, you get to over 640,000, okay? Which is more than heart disease and more than cancer. And if you look at the tenure of someone like Fauci, over 40 years, Americans have experienced the lowest longevity rates in the Western world, and the highest infant mortality rate. Now, we're not, and I think nearly 50 or 54% of kids are, have some type of autoimmune disorder. We have dirty air, dirty water, dirty food, which is what contributes to, the immunocompromising situation of people. But this, I don't see a state of emergency ever being called with the 500,000 plus people who die of heart disease.
No, or as I pointed out, Doctor, when all this was starting and we had just minuscule amounts of deaths, we have up to 60,000 people die every year from the seasonal flu, and not once have I seen the media, the mainstream media, over the years report on that. I mean, they don't say anything. So they were saying like 3 people have died today from the coronavirus. Meanwhile, 5,000 people are dying, technically even more than that because the flu season's only 4 or 5 months long. 10 to 12,000 people were dying every month from the seasonal flu. They never reported that.
Right. And the reality is that we have conflated this entire thing, and people really need to understand why. Because most of the people dying of this are, 79, 80 plus with pre-existing conditions.
What do you think would happen? And then we'll start taking calls here from our listeners. You'll really enjoy this. What do you think would happen if they said, okay, America, we're opening up the doors again. You go back to work, go back to school. Vegas, open up again. All over the country, go back to what you were doing. What do you think would happen?
Well, I think, so if you do the math on this, right? So we have immunocompromised people, we have elderly people. Now, if you assume we did that and we layered in with the plan I sent to President Trump, which is basically you take the immunocompromised people who tested positive, and this is not my, I've sort of consolidated, but there's many, many people, scientists who recorded this in multiple papers. So, foregoing that, right, if we do that, and then people go back to work and you put people on even some supplemental D and A to protect themselves, what I think we're going to, so let's take the worst, forget the Spanish flu for a second because that was an anomaly and we'll talk about that, but the worst pandemic in the United States, 15% people got it and 0.3% of the people died. Let's say we even double it, okay? Let's say 30%. This is like the worst case. Mm-hmm. Perhaps this is like an outlier, which means 90 million people get infected, and 0.6% of those people, right, which is doubling than the 0.3%, die. That would mean about 540,000. Well, that's about the same number as heart disease, isn't it?
Right.
Well, we didn't, getting back to the point, we did not shut down the economy because of that. So it really comes down to if those people who claim they're into public health, if they truly care about people, well, we would really be addressing the fact that they're immunocompromised. And those people we would give them preventative measures. We would quarantine them, and then we would move on with our lives. That's what needs to happen. This is a complex system. You cannot take a reductionist approach and just say we need to quarantine everyone to protect, frankly, a very small subset. I'm not trying to be someone who's Darwinian here, but when you apply the same yardstick, we're not doing that with cancer or heart disease. So what is the real agenda? Frankly, when you look at it from the map, it makes no sense. Anyone applying simple, basic math will see it doesn't make any sense. So what is the agenda? In my view, the agenda is the notion of a highly, highly centralized government, a highly centralized state, to see how much they can get away with. And that's what we're seeing before us.
Why doesn't China come clean and say, we developed this, we've got an antidote for it, we've got something that'll fix this and cure it? Why don't they do that? Or are they the wrong ones?
Well, I think, look, out of this economically, China's going to come out, really good. India was growing around, as I mentioned, 6 to 7%. The U.S. at 2%. Now the U.S. at this rate will go to negative 3% and India 2%. I don't think it wasn't coincidental that Trump went to visit Prime Minister Modi in India, if you remember, right?
Right.
A few weeks before all of this occurred.
That's right.
I'm right.
Unprecedented visit for a president. I can't remember any other presidents that went to India.
Yeah, not at that level. And yeah, so it's quite extraordinary. And I've said for years, why isn't it the two greatest democracies uniting? Why do we support these countries who are, from a foreign policy? And I think Trump was sending a very clear signal to China. And you have to understand, China, the Chinese government, has a very, very, very backstabbing nature. There's a very famous picture of one of the former prime ministers of India, Nehru, in the 1960s, trying to avert a war between India and China, visiting China, hugging Zhou Enlai, who was the premier of China, and thinking that there was not going to be a war. And literally the next day, China invades India. Okay?
Yeah.
So you have to understand that the Chinese Communist Party has a 100-year plan.
Well, and because you're right, because people are so desensitized, they seem to forget China is a communist country with its own agenda.
Not only an agenda that goes every 4 years, which are run by the lawyer lobbyists in this country, who most of them can't fix any problems. In China, you know who the revered celebrities are? Engineers and scientists.
Right.
So they have some really sharp people who run their government.
They're brilliant.
They're brilliant, and they're thinking 100, 200 years. Their plan isn't like, what's the 5-year or 10? They're thinking, what is the 100-year plan?
They have the patience to wait it out too, Doctor. We don't.
Right. And so right now, because of the monetary policy that's taken place, China has a lot of reserve. Dollar is in reserve. And the current model that just took place, we basically printed $6 trillion. And it's the crack model that Obama set up, that you keep having to print money. And a lot of this, if the economy crashes, and Trump may have another brilliant plan, I'm open to that, but China will be the one who will be able to use their, reserves in dollars and buy, large parts of the U.S. economy at a song. So we have to understand that China has everything to gain from this. They suppress dissension in their own country. They get to, further beef up their economy and buy more of U.S. assets. That's what this is really about. And it's also consolidation of power for Big Pharma. And China has its allies with the WHO, also within the CDC. CDC and China work very closely together. And the different foundations which essentially evade taxes. The Gates Foundation, the Clinton Global Initiative, the Zuckerberg Foundation, they're not here to help us. Those were tax dollars that should go to the American people. Right? Instead, they're allowed to essentially evade those taxes, put them into their own foundations, and be basically an external government dictating policy.
Gosh, Shiva, you sound like you're running for the Senate from Massachusetts, for crying out loud.
Well, I am running. I ran last 2 years ago, remember, against Elizabeth Warren. I'm running against a guy called Markey. We're running a very powerful campaign, and the GOP establishment is so afraid of us. But I'm running against 3 lawyers.
Yeah, your primary is September 1st, right?
September 1st, and we have amazing volunteers on the ground. We need to get 10,000 signatures. We've actually been doing it. So the GOP establishment, who hates Trump, through a guy who's got I think he's got 100 Twitter followers. And he's just a lawyer who comes from, Greenwich, Connecticut, with his own, he's never done never really knows how to fix nothing. They've actually, we believe, have illegally funded him, from all the data that we have, to go get signatures for him because he has no ground game. But it's the same old stuff, right? You don't want outsiders coming in. You don't want everyday working people who can actually fix problems. You want to perpetuate this deep state. And by the way, Massachusetts, in my view, is the center of the deep state. It's the epicenter of it. It's where all the, sort of the swamp creatures are created.
Interesting.
That go all over the world.
Interesting indeed. So you would do what right now with this coronavirus? Would you just get people back to school, back to work?
I laid it out in that plan. First of all, let's follow a personalized, approach to public health, which is divide up the country into 4 groups. Those people who have COVID, and give them a certain protocol. Those people who are immunocompromised, a different protocol. And those people who are critical. But the vast majority of the 330 million people, probably at least 90% of us, let's say 80%, are, able-bodied, right? Give them some protection and get them back to work.
What
we do.
Well, and here's what concerns me about the patient zero theory. If we cured everybody on this planet except one person, theoretically, based on what we've seen happen,
it would start again.
It would start all over again. Exactly.
Yeah, that's what they're doing, is flattening the curve. It's flattening the curve for what? Kicking it down the line? The reason they want to flatten the curve is because of the corruption of the hospital infrastructure system. By the way, to give you some numbers, 1.9 million hospitalizations take place from adverse reactions to prescription drugs every year in the United States.
Exactly. But you never hear about that.
Well, how many of those people in these hospitals are adverse reaction drug people? If you look at those numbers, 1.9 million divided, by 12 months is what? It's 100,000 people. Right, in the hospital.
Well, the important thing, too, is that you're not downplaying this disease. It's a wretched disease.
No. There is a virus.
Yep.
There is a virus. It is a version of the SARS or MERS virus. It's the coronavirus. 1,500 nucleotides are different. It appears to have a higher infectivity rate. Not anywhere near as the fatality rate of SARS, which is, I believe, 10 or 15%. MERS was 40%. So high infectivity, low, relatively low mortality rate. That's what we have. But again, we have to understand these viruses are not the things that kill us. When the virus comes into people who are immunocompromised, the body's own immune system, let's say some of these people is only firing on one cylinder.
Basically turns on itself, doesn't it?
Turns on itself, exactly. So you have your body eating away itself, and the virus particles essentially go deposit themselves in areas where the cytokine response takes place.
Shiva, when we come back, we're going to take some phone calls with you. Everybody's lined up, so we will take promised calls in just a moment with Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. His website linked up at coasttocoastam.com. He has done some splendid work, and we may not have time to talk about when he was 14 and came up with the email software, but we will come and get your calls in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. So those of you who have been on hold for a while, we'll do our best to get right to you when we come right back. Okay, we're going to take your calls now this half hour with Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. Let's just go to George in Corpus Christi, Texas to get us going. Hey, George, go ahead. Thanks for holding.
Oh, no problem. Well, quickly, because I know you got a lot of other people. The polio virus, the smallpox virus, all these were wiped out with vaccines. So why, if your guest could explain why the thing with today's worry with vaccines. I mean, and they're developing one. They said they're going to have one in about a year and a half for this particular condition. I'd like him to expound on that, and I'll hang up, George, so you can get other
Okay,
guests.
George, sure thing. So did vaccines eradicate polio, Dr. Shiva?
Well, it's a very, very important and interesting question, okay? It's a very important question. So what we're talking about is what eradicated infectious diseases. If we go actually look at the facts, we found out, and this is in the United States, we can look at it globally. In the United States, if you looked at the percentage of the U.S. population with infectious disease in 1900, it was around, for every 100,000 people, 14 people had an infectious disease, okay? Now, by the time, before the polio virus even got created, and respectively before the measles virus got created, we had wiped out 98% of infectious diseases. Let me repeat. Before those vaccines came, for example, it's measles vaccine, 98% of measles was eradicated before the measles vaccine.
What eradicates it without a vaccine? What causes the eradication?
Great question. What did that? What brought that precipitous decline? Sanitation.
Aha.
Okay, nutrition, vitamin A, eliminating child labor, refrigeration. What was the United States like in the late 1800s, early 1900s? It was the burgeoning of the industrial era, right? And these factories were hellholes in many ways.
Sure.
Right? So the working class movement in this country, working people in the late 1800s fought for that. It's not like the politicians or Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave those to these people. It was they fought for them. They were rich, major wins from people's names who we don't even know. Infrastructure. That's what brought down infectious diseases.
What happened to SARS, Doctor? Did it just eradicate itself, or is it so minuscule we don't hear about it anymore?
Well, remember, these viruses don't infect everyone, right?
Right, exactly.
They don't infect all 100,000 people. As I mentioned, 15% are about the group in a population or that will get infected, like in the United States, right? So what is happening, right? The first point is we need to take away from the numbers I just shared with you. The plumber and the sanitation worker did more to reduce infectious diseases than the pharmacist or the doctor. This is just a fact. What we have today is we're back to dirty air, dirty water, dirty food. It's not like gunk like you see in the 1900s, but it's more invisible, right? The poison in our foods, the poison in the air, etc. And that infrastructure is brought to you by the decaying infrastructure that's taking place in this country. In Massachusetts, for example, Massachusetts got an F minus in infrastructure. The U.S. a D plus. We have old water systems, crumbling bridges, etc. Those are the things, and the dirty air, dirty water, dirty food that compromise people's immune system. But we don't want to address that, right? We don't call states of emergency on that. But so how does the vaccine work? What happens is your body, if it's strong, if it's reasonably strong, is waiting to receive a vaccine, go through its process, and create the antibodies, okay? And whole other things that support your immune system. So the body seeks resilience. It is ready to take a vaccine on and protect you, right? That's the natural state. So if you look back thousands of years ago, before the development of vaccines, how did people protect themselves? If you had a village, let's say they found out some guy had a virus, well, they would literally take the pus of that virus, a small piece of it, in China, for example, and shoot it up into people's nose.
Wow.
In India and other countries like Africa, they would do a technique called variolation, which is you create a small incision or an abrasion in the forearm, and you literally put the virus onto it.
Did that work?
Yeah. Look, in villages, for example, it's a horse. But think about a village as a industrial or a economic unit, right? They had to, let's say there are 100 farmers. Each farmer has a horse or cow that needs to be pulled to get ready for making food, right? Harvest, etc. Let's say a horse got some virus. You know what they did? They would put a bag over that horse that said have it sneeze and give it to all the other horses. That was inoculation. In the Revolutionary War, an African slave brought the technique of variolation, where you made a small abrasion incision and you gave a virus. That's what Washington used to protect 40,000 of his troops, because he knew the British would unleash smallpox. My point is the concept of inoculation, what I call stress inoculation, which is a proven way to build your immune system, has been used for thousands of years. Now, in that model, you assume people had healthy immune systems. Now, a vaccine is an attempt it's a pale attempt to emulate that. So they take a virus and they deaden it, and then that virus was given to people. However, many times it wasn't working. It wasn't achieving the immune response. You know what? They started adding things like aluminum and started mercury to create that immune response. Well, those two additional chemicals, for example, are adjuvants, as they're known, and they have other carcinogenic and other ill immune health effects. You follow what I'm saying?
I do.
So the vaccine was a mimicking of what we were doing anyway in nature, to try to take care of ourselves. So the issue is, it's not pro or anti-vax. It's more about what do you need. So if you were brought up in an environment where your mother or father kept you in a little bubble, right, and sanitized everything, and you were never allowed to go play outside with kids,
you're gonna get sick the minute you breathe.
Exactly. So those people, if they put them out in the world, I would argue should probably get titrated some of these vaccines. You see, it's not a one-size-fits-all model. will be slowly exposed. Otherwise, you're going to hurt them. On the other hand, if you were like us who grew up, right, you played in dirt, you played tackle football on the streets, right, as a kid, you got exposed to everything. Your body became stronger. Well, those people don't need all this stuff, and you have to really question why the Center for, the CDC has put out a guideline that a young kid, by the time he's 14 or 15, has to get 30 different vaccines, up to 70 doses, including hepatitis 1B, which is what's given to, which is for IV drug users.
Well,
right?
what I don't understand, though, about the coronavirus, Doctor, is the fact that everybody's closeted away, and it's still out there, and it still seems to be growing. So, shutting it down, shutting the world down isn't working.
It's not going to work. You're kicking down the can. You're kicking down the can down the road. So, I think you mentioned the flu hit, I think, around 62 million people, right?
Well, and 60,000 people die from it.
Right. So these viruses come and go, and the reason that you have a higher mortality, particularly during the September to December time, is why? Why? We don't have as much sun then. Okay? The sun goes, we get less UVB radiation, which is a healthy thing that creates vitamin D. So you're right. And the fact that you tell people to stay inside, they'll never get any sunlight. Exactly. So it's basically, I keep telling people that the vitamin D is literally like a gun, okay? And when the sun is the one that creates that gun, and that gun goes through a process where the bullets for that gun get created through these cathelicidins. And those bullets really knock out the membrane of these viruses, bacteria, etc. So you can just look it up, type in cathelicidin, CATHELECIDIN. People can learn a lot. So the entire goal here is we have to understand as human civilization that changes take place in the weather, and we should apply preventative measures. We should be beefing up people's immune systems. That's what real public health is, not, quote-unquote, waiting for this crisis, right, quote-unquote crisis, and then telling everyone to shut down the whole economy. Is this how we're going to do it from now on, where every time there's a new virus that comes down, we shut down our whole
economy? Let's hope not. Let's go to our first-time caller, Todd in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Go ahead, Todd.
Hi, George. Hi, Doc.
Hi.
I got a quick question. In October, for the third time, I had a blood test from my rheumatologist, and I tested my ANA and dsDNA were both positive. I said, what does that mean? She says, your autoimmune system is attacking itself. So does that mean if I get this virus, I have no way to fight it?
What would happen? What happened if his autoimmune system is attacking his own body right now, Shiva?
Right. So the important thing is, look, when you have an autoimmune disorder, right, these autoimmune disorders vary, right? But what it means is your immune system is compromised in some way, that it doesn't know how to modulate itself. Many of these autoimmune issues, in traditional systems of medicine, all disease always have the same issue. You go back to three important things: your genetics, your epigenetics, and how were you exposed to stress, which means can your body get resilient? Now, I don't know your particular, disease. I'm a PhD who studies the immune system. I'm not a medical doctor, right? What I can tell you is that when your body is not functioning properly, you have autoimmunity, and that can be caused by so many things right now. External substances, you can be exposed to things, some level of genetics, but primarily things you're not getting in your diet or the wrong things you're taking. And so people with autoimmune disorders are more immunocompromised. But the good news is that if you just go look at the literature and you start studying how do you modulate the immune system, vitamin A and vitamin D. If you were to do two things, really look at vitamin D and vitamin A levels, I would ask your physician to say, hey, let me test my vitamin D and vitamin A levels. Let me test my thyroid levels. I don't know what your diet is. If you eat a lot of sugars, if people eat a high sugar diet, your body...
not good.
This is Candida. Candida creates these gliotoxins, which actually suppress some of the cylinders in your immune system, which is the macrophages and the T cells. So other systems will take over and try to compensate and create, what you call an autoimmune disorder.
Let's go to Jim in Ohio. Squeeze you in here, Jimmy. Go ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me that from my reading that there's very few precious sources that tell the truth, the alternate truth from the corporate controlled media in this country, and one of them is Global Research, globalresearch.ca, and they've had a series which I interrupted reading about them after my laptop was stolen, about the COVID virus and who's really behind it. And this attempt to demonize China and before them with the Russiagate phony scandal hoax has gone on for 70 years and 100 years, respectively, to create the kind of mindset that allow us to wars and conflict and provocation against these countries that justified the $1,000 billion we're wasting and bleeding our economy with to the military-industrial complex every year.
Let's get your final comments on this as we're almost out of time, Shiva. I just think China has a huge role here. What do you think?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's China along with other entities who do not like this president, okay? Who never liked him from day one.
Or this country. You can't take us down militarily, so you take us down economically.
Exactly. And, I think people need to understand that what we're talking about in 2020 is, do we head towards freedom or slavery? That's what this is really about, and every generation has to face that. Lincoln talked about it, John Kennedy talked about it, and now we're facing it. It's the coronavirus is essentially the question about freedom versus slavery, and for people to, get educated. It's an opportunity for, people should start knowing the truth for themselves, being their own light, and finding your way. Because you can't trust mainstream media. You can't trust mainstream academia. They're all paid, they practice the oldest profession now. But what I find is working people of common sense, like people that grew up in New Jersey, plumbers, electricians, engineers, farmers, people who make stuff, they actually get it. Because
the working people, they get it. They get it indeed.
Yeah,
but
the vulnerable, educated elites, I see them walking around like drones.
If we see the mandatory vaccines, Dr. Shiva, we're going to know something's up. So good luck in your election on September 1st, your primary, and then keep in touch with us because you bring a different perspective to this very sad story. We'll be back in a moment with Lynn McTaggart as we talk about intention.